On 3rd November 2024, in the soft gray light over Burr's Lodge Street in Asheville, North Carolina, a conservator stood alone in a back corridor of Biltmore House, reaching up to dust a small brass clock above the servants' stair. Outside, the lawns are empty. Inside, the 250-room mansion waits to reopen after flood and wind have torn at the valley again. On her clipboard is a photocopy of an 1895 order for the turret clock that once drove 14 slave clocks across the servants' domain with a penciled note in the margin, "Clock is to be up and running by December 25th, 1895. She adjusts the shaded electric lamp on the wall to see the old ink, a domestic gesture that once meant nothing more than keep to schedule. Now the same gesture reads differently. In a house built to devour time, wages, and an entire valley of labor, every synchronized minute has a human cost attached. When the clock starts ticking again, it will not say who paid for all those minutes. By the spring of 1888, George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, slipped away from New York to recuperate in the healing air around Asheville, North Carolina. Local papers note the presence of a Vanderbilt scion in Buncombe County, but the real anchor is in his own correspondence. Descriptions of blue hills, clear water, and quiet that make the mountains sound like a cure for the noise of Manhattan. In Manhattan, he is the quiet brother in an aggressive dynasty, bookish, unmarried, speaking multiple languages, content to collect art while his older brothers manage railroads and compete over Fifth Avenue palaces. William K. Vanderbilt builds Marble House in Newport. Cornelius II erects the Breakers. George, at 26, seems to prefer libraries to boardrooms. But in these hills, something shifts. He starts buying parcels of land, first hundreds of acres, then thousands, until the total approaches 125,000 acres along the French Broad and Swannanoa valleys. The Biltmore estate deeds record sellers as small farmers, storekeepers, and timber owners whose property lines vanish into a single estate name, Biltmore. Each transaction is documented with the precision of a corporate merger, surveys, witnesses, county clerk stamps. What doesn't appear in the legal language is the conversation that must have preceded each signature. A farmer weighing cash now against land his grandchildren might have worked, a widow deciding whether the offer for her husband's timber tract is generous or simply unavoidable. Each new purchase is filed as a transaction. The human part, the decision to leave a family cemetery behind, to move a cabin up the road, to follow work into the estate's orbit, stays off the page. Later histories describe Vanderbilt as a benevolent landowner, paying fair prices and improving degraded forests. The deeds themselves are silent on whether fair meant the same thing to both parties, or whether some sellers had much choice at all when the richest family in America decided it wanted your ridge. By 1889, survey maps show the estate extending from the French Broad River bottomlands up into the steep slopes of the southern Appalachians, a private domain, larger than some European principalities, assembled parcel by parcel in less than 2 years. The speed suggests not just money, but a kind of inevitability. Once Vanderbilt decided he wanted the valley was already his. In the ledgers, the valley becomes a portfolio. On the ground, it becomes someone's last season in their own fields. The operation begins as a man taking the air, but the first target is already clear: other people's ground. By 1889, survey stakes marked a 3-mile spur line slicing toward the future house site, linking the Richmond and Danville Railroad directly to Vanderbilt's chosen ridge. The archival notation is dry: a 3-mile railroad spur, a brick kiln, a woodworking factory, contracts for about 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons. In practice, it means steam whistles echoing against the hills at dawn, carloads of Indiana limestone grinding up the spur, and a new workday rhythm that belongs to a private house rather than a public project. The temporary infrastructure alone rivals some municipal projects. A brick kiln produces materials on site, a woodworking mill turns estate timber into paneling and trim, a quarry operation processes stone, a narrow-gauge railway hauls materials up the slope. Workers live in a temporary village near the tracks, a cluster of rough buildings housing carpenters, masons, laborers, and their families. The settlement has its own commissary, its own informal hierarchy, its own rhythms, but all synchronized to the needs of construction rising on the hill. Tools recorded in invoices, derricks, stone saws, compressed air drills, turn the slope above Asheville into an industrial zone whose product will never be open to the town. The technology is borrowed from railroad construction, bridge building, and commercial architecture, but deployed here for a single family's winter residence. The scale of the operation draws workers from across the region and beyond, local men who know the terrain, skilled craftsmen from the north, European stonemasons brought in specifically for ornamental work. At the temporary worker village near the tracks, men check pocket watches against the master schedule coming from the estate office. In later years, the house will use an elaborate clock system to govern servants' movements. During construction, the same logic applies to stonemasons and carpenters. Time is money, but more precisely, time is Vanderbilt's money, and every hour on the clock represents wages paid, materials consumed, progress measured against architectural drawings that specify exactly where each limestone block must sit. The workforce is divided by skill and inevitably by race. Skilled positions, masonry, carpentry, electrical work, go primarily to white workers, many brought in from outside the region. The heaviest labor, hauling, digging, clearing, is often performed by black workers and local laborers paid at lower rates. The division is nowhere explicit in the surviving payroll records, but the pattern is consistent with construction practices throughout the Jim Crow South, where skilled trades were effectively reserved for white workers while black workers were confined to unskilled positions regardless of capability. By the time stone reaches the rising façade, it has already passed through dozens of hands, the cost of each block reduced to line items and hourly rates. A limestone block quarried in Indiana travels by rail to Asheville, transfers to the estate spur, gets unloaded by laborers, shaped by stonemasons, hoisted by crane operators, and set by specialized craftsmen, each step a separate wage calculation, each worker a number in someone's ledger. The house is literally wired into systems meant for factories and railroads, but the result will be called a home. The railroad spur is temporary, torn up after construction ends, but it sets a pattern. Industrial machinery feeding a private appetite. The logic that builds Biltmore is corporate, efficient, rationalized, measured in man-hours and material costs, even as the rhetoric around it speaks of beauty, craftsmanship, and a gentleman's retreat. In the early 1890s, Asheville's Pearson store, serving the Shiloh and Hominy communities, appears in a local paper in the past tense. The store has disappeared into Biltmore's growing holdings. Behind that word sit a series of buyouts. Families in the small communities of Shiloh and Best sell or are persuaded to sell land inside what will become the estate boundary. The transactions are legal, documented, and apparently voluntary, but the cumulative effect is the erasure of entire settlements from the map. County records and later reporting describe the quiet relocation of churches and cemeteries. In some cases, headstones from family plots are moved to new churchyards outside the gates. In others, stone markers remain inside, patching the estate's memory of who was there first. The practical challenges are considerable: disinterring remains, transporting them to new ground, resettling markers, and maintaining some continuity of memory even as the physical site changes hands. In one documented instance, Shiloh's church and graveyard are moved uphill to what becomes New Shiloh, the original site absorbed into estate forestry and fields. The congregation must have made the decision collectively, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps with compensation that seemed adequate at the time. But the effect is a kind of geographic amnesia. The old site becomes farmland or forest within the estate, while the community reconstitutes itself a mile away, its history now tied to displacement rather than continuity. No telegrams announce this. The only archival traces are land transfers, church minutes, and cemetery maps. 1. Deed might note the sale of 20 acres, including improvements. Another records the purchase of a small parcel for consideration of $500 and other valuable considerations. The legal language is formulaic, revealing nothing of the negotiations or the emotions involved. Did families leave willingly, lured by cash offers? Were they pressured by neighbors who had already sold, making it impossible to maintain community if they stayed? The documents don't say. For Vanderbilt, advised by Frederick Law Olmsted and architect Richard Morris Hunt, the goal is continuity. A designed landscape that looks natural, with tenant farms and woodlots feeding a self-sustaining domain. Olmsted's vision emphasizes managed forests, scenic vistas, and agricultural operations that blend into the picturesque landscape. The great landscape architect sees the depleted hillsides as a canvas for restoration, not to their original state, but to an improved, rationalized version that serves both aesthetic and economic purposes. For those leaving, it is the end of continuity. A graveyard represents generations. Children who died young, grandparents who cleared the land, family members whose names connect the living to place and time. Moving those graves breaks something fundamental, even if the bones and stones are carefully transported to new ground. The place itself, the specific hillside, the particular trees, the view from the churchyard, cannot be moved, and with it goes a kind of belonging that no amount of compensation can replace. By the time the foundations are poured, an entire community exists mostly in church records and moved stones. The land is remembered differently now, as fields designed by Olmsted, forests replanted under scientific management, scenic drives calculated for maximum picturesque effect. What it forgets is written in the gap between old cemetery maps and new property lines, a silence where names and places used to meet. On 24th of December 1895, George Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to family and invited guests. Newspapers described the house outside Asheville as an American chateau with 250 rooms and modern marvels such as electric lights, elevators, and forced air heating humming beneath the limestone skin. The opening is both private and performative, family and friends only, but with the clear understanding that descriptions will reach the press and the wider public, establishing Biltmore as one of the great houses of the Gilded Age. The scale defies easy comprehension. 250 rooms translates to approximately 175,000 square feet under roof, a structure so vast that sections of it will remain barely used even when the family is in residence. 33 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, and a banquet hall that seats 64 beneath a barrel-vaulted ceiling 70 feet long. The numbers themselves become a form of spectacle repeated in newspaper, accounts, and visitor descriptions with a kind of awe. In a carriage courtyard out of sight of the banquet hall, an E. Howard turret clock, shipped by rail that autumn and installed above the stables, ticks in a small green-painted room. Its mechanism drives 14 slave clocks placed in kitchen corridors, pantries, and servants' halls, the electrical pulses keeping the invisible staff precisely on Vanderbilt time. The technology is borrowed from railroad stations and factories, where synchronized timekeeping ensures coordination across large, complex operations. Applied to a private house, it reveals the same logic. This is not a home, but a machine, and the people who operate it must move in perfect coordination. House records and later horological research describe the system in detail: minute impulses, oak cases, zinc dials, a master directive that the clocks be up and running by December 25, 1895. The urgency in that note, written by whom, a construction supervisor, an estate manager, suggests the importance placed on the clock system as part of the house's essential infrastructure. Without synchronized time, the elaborate choreography of service would collapse into chaos. In the servants' dining room, a maid glances up between courses, aligning her steps to the next call bell. The wall clock shows 7:42. She knows she has 18 minutes before the family's next course must be cleared and the following one served. The precision is not cruelty exactly, but it is relentless. Every task is timed, every movement calculated, every delay visible on the unforgiving face of the clock. Upstairs, guests marvel that in such a vast house, breakfast arrives hot and nearly silent. They don't see the network of service corridors, backstairs, and dumbwaiters that make that magic possible. They don't see the kitchen staff who rose at 5 to begin preparations, or the footmen who carried heavy trays up narrow stairs, or the maids who slipped into bedrooms while guests were at breakfast to make beds and lay fires without being noticed. The technology that keeps the 250-room stage lit depends on dozens of people living in attic corridors and basement rooms, their own time partitioned into tasks. The master clock is installed as a symbol of order. It also becomes a metronome for exhaustion. Officially, the house opens with a toast. Unofficially, it begins with a clock that never sleeps. By the early 1900s, staffing numbers solidified. Historical guides and estate archives alike mention around 80 servants required to run the house, gardens, and stables, with up to 40 domestic staff on duty in the main house at any given time. These are not abstract numbers. Each represents a person with a name, a history, a reason for taking work that demands everything and offers little beyond wages and a small room. We know some names. Laura Barker served as the first head housekeeper from 1895 to 1897, responsible for managing the household staff, ordering supplies, maintaining standards, and serving as the primary interface between the servants' world and the family's expectations. When she leaves in 1897, Emily Rand King replaces her and remains until 1914, referred to in correspondence and staff lists simply as Mrs. King. The title marks her status: married or widowed, mature, authoritative, trusted with enormous responsibility and relatively little authority over her own working conditions. There is Walter Harvey, butler in the late 1890s, and a roster of maids, footmen, and kitchen staff drawn from North Carolina, England, Ireland, Sweden, and beyond. The diversity is partly about skill. European servants trained in grand houses brought standards and techniques not yet common in American domestic service, and partly about hierarchy. English and European servants often commanded higher wages and held more prestigious positions than American workers, reinforcing social distinctions even within the servants' quarters. Their world is mapped by the clock system. In the servants' hall, the master clock's minute jump dictates meal times. In the pastry kitchen, a secondary clock times baking. In laundry rooms, it measures boiler runs. The clocks govern not just when to work, but how to think about work, as a series of timed tasks rather than a flow of craft or care. A footman doesn't simply serve dinner. He executes a 17-minute sequence from retrieving dishes to clearing plates. A maid doesn't clean a bedroom. She follows a 12-minute protocol for making a bed to exact specifications. Average shifts for Gilded Age domestic workers commonly ran 12 to 14 hours, and Biltmore's complexity suggests similar or longer days, even if exact schedules vary by role. A kitchen maid might begin at 5:30 a.m. to prepare servants' breakfast and family breakfast, work through the day with a brief afternoon break, and finish after cleaning up from dinner service at 9 or 10 p.m. A lady's maid might have more irregular hours but be on call whenever her employer needs assistance, potentially from early morning through late evening if there are social events. The Vanderbilts pay New York wages, according to estate material, with high-ranking staff earning up to $2 per day plus room and board, more than local standards. In a region where agricultural labor might earn $0.50 to $1 per day, $2 is genuinely attractive. But the calculation is more complex than the wage alone suggests. Room and board means living in the attic or basement of your workplace with little privacy and less freedom. High standards mean constant vigilance against mistakes that could cost your position. And the isolation of the estate means limited opportunities to spend your wages or build a life outside of service. Yet the bargain is clear. In exchange for higher pay and status, servants must synchronize their lives to someone else's idea of perfection. As the house becomes famous for its ease, the people who make that ease possible disappear, further into the walls. In 1892, Vanderbilt hired Gifford Pinchot, then a young forester trained in Europe, to rehabilitate his newly acquired forests. Pinchot's reports describe exhausted hillsides, erosion, and clear-cut ravines, conditions created by the very timber economy Vanderbilt's money once rode. The irony is not lost on later historians. the fortune built partly on extractive industries now deployed to repair extraction's damage, at least on one man's private domain. Pinchot is 27, ambitious, educated in French and German forestry methods, and eager to prove that scientific management can make American forests both profitable and sustainable. His arrival marks Biltmore as one of the first large-scale experiments in managed forestry in the United States, not preservation in the wilderness sense, but active intervention to improve timber yields while maintaining forest health over time. The work is physical and technical at once. Pinchot and his assistants surveyed the property, mapping tree species, measuring diameters, estimating ages, and calculating board feet of standing timber. They mark trees for selective cutting, lay out access roads, plan fire breaks, and begin experimenting with different harvesting techniques. The goal is sustained yield, taking only what the forest can replace annually, ensuring a permanent timber supply rather than a one-time payout. When Pinchot leaves in 1895 to pursue his career in government forestry, eventually becoming the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Vanderbilt replaces him with Carl Alwyn Schenck, a German forester who founded the Biltmore Forest School in 1898. Schenck's hand-drawn management plans, preserved in archives, show compartmentalized forest tracts, fire lines, and selective cutting schedules, a landscape reimagined as a machine for producing timber, wildlife habitat, and scenic beauty in carefully calibrated proportions. Students, many of them young men from rural backgrounds seeking careers in the emerging forestry profession, learn to pace off transects, tally board feet, and fight fires on steep slopes. The curriculum combines classroom instruction with practical fieldwork. Students spend weeks in the forest, living in camps, learning to read landscapes, understanding tree growth, practicing surveying techniques, and developing the physical endurance required for forest work. Their tools are measured: axes, saws, notebooks, and eventually narrow-gauge logging railroads and wagons. They speak of blisters and fatigue in diaries and letters. Official reports talk instead of progressive forestry and scientific management. One student diary from 1899 notes, "Worked the north slope until my hands bled through the gloves." Dr. Schenck says this is normal for the first week. The gap between the rhetoric of professionalism and the reality of physical labor is never quite bridged. For families downstream, the new forestry regime means fewer catastrophic floods and more stable slopes, a genuine improvement over the slash-and-burn logging that had characterized much of the region's timber industry. For the workers in the woods, it means permanent labor in a landscape that is no longer theirs. The men cutting trees, building roads, and fighting fires are often the sons or grandsons of families who once owned small parcels, now absorbed into the estate. They work for wages on land their relatives sold, following management plans designed in Germany and implemented by a man whose wealth came from railroads they will never ride. Conservation here is not simply protection, it is the reorganization of nature and work around a single owner's lifetime. The forest becomes productive again, but on whose terms and for whose ultimate benefit remains an open question that the forestry school's textbooks never quite address. By the late 1890s, Biltmore Village stood near the estate gate, planned by architect Richard Sharp Smith as a picturesque English village for workers and tenants. Pebble-dash cottages, a church, shops, and the imposing bank building at 12 Lodge Street create the impression of a harmonious company town. The aesthetics are deliberate: half-timbered facades, steeply pitched roofs, carefully designed irregularity that makes the village look organic and old rather than planned and new. The village is where pay envelopes are cashed, where estate police enforce rules, and where workers' lives are subtly shaped around Vanderbilt's needs. The architecture suggests benevolence, comfortable housing, community amenities, visual charm, but the underlying structure is one of control. The estate owns the land, the buildings, and most of the businesses. Workers live there at the estate's pleasure, shop at stores whose hours accommodate estate schedules, worship at a church the estate helped build. Oral histories and local research describe a mix of gratitude for steady wages in a volatile region and quiet resentment at the estate's reach. Some families remember Biltmore as a source of opportunity, offering employment that allowed them to stay in the region when others had to migrate north for factory work. Others remember the sense of being watched, the awareness that stepping out of line could cost not just your job, but your housing, your credit, your standing in the community. Inside the house, Mrs. King meets with George and Edith Vanderbilt in the oak sitting room to review menus and guest schedules, a ritual repeated weekly throughout the season. The meetings are cordial but hierarchical. Mrs. King makes suggestions, the Vanderbilts approve or modify, and the housekeeper returns to the servants' quarters to implement decisions about which she had limited input. The power dynamic is cushioned by courtesy but never in doubt. Outside, shopkeepers adjust their hours to carriage timetables and train arrivals feeding the estate. The village pharmacy stays open late when guests are arriving. The grocery orders, supplies in quantities dictated by the house's social calendar. The same logic ties both worlds together. Time, consumption, and appearance calibrated to keep the great house glowing. Each evening, as lamps are lit along the village street and in servants' corridors, someone reaches up to adjust a shade and checks the clock without thinking. The gesture looks ordinary. It is actually the smallest visible part of a comprehensive system. The clocks in the servants' quarters synchronize with the clocks in the village shops, which coordinate with the railroad timetable, which aligns with the schedule of the great house itself. The village is charming in photographs, quaint cottages, careful landscaping, a sense of order and prosperity. In lived experience, it is something more ambiguous. A place where security comes with strings attached, where community exists within boundaries set by a single family's needs, where the line between paternalism and control is never quite clear. What looks like a community on postcards is, in the documents, an infrastructure of dependence. Estate research estimates that by 1902, maintaining Biltmore costs more than $6,000 per month, over $70,000 a year at the time, just to keep the house staffed, heated, and supplied. The number is staggering even by Gilded Age standards, representing an annual operating expense equivalent to the total wealth of many successful businessmen. And this is merely to keep the house running, not to build it, expand it, or acquire more land. To offset this, Vanderbilt invests in Biltmore dairy, pig and poultry farms, and crop production along the French Broad River, hoping to make the estate self-sustaining. The logic is appealing. If the estate's farms can feed its residents and sell surplus to the region, the land can partially pay for the house that crowns it. The dairy operation became particularly ambitious, with Jersey cattle producing high-quality milk, cream, and butter marketed under the Biltmore brand. Ledgers record milk yields, butter sales, hog weights, and poultry counts. The dairy became well known in the region, with refrigerated rail cars eventually carrying Biltmore-branded products beyond Asheville. For middle-class families in the growing city, Biltmore Dairy represents quality and prestige, milk from the same estate that supplies the Vanderbilt table. Each line of income, however, is dwarfed by the ongoing expense of 80 servants, imported furnishings, and continuous maintenance on a 250-room structure. The arithmetic never quite works. The dairy might generate $800 in a good month. The house costs $6,000. The forests might sell timber worth $2,000 annually. Maintaining the grounds costs multiples of that. The estate is an economic impossibility, sustained only by external wealth, the dividends from Vanderbilt's inheritance, the returns on railroad and industrial investments made by his father and grandfather. Field hands, farm managers, and dairy workers are hired, often from local families and African-American communities in the region. The work is regular but demanding, milking before dawn, haying in summer heat, feeding cattle in winter sleet. The dairy operates on industrial principles, production quotas, quality standards, delivery schedules. But the labor is agricultural, physical, and relentless. The staff's names surface sporadically in payrolls and census records, but their labor appears in firm numbers, gallons, acres, tons. A census taker in 1900 might record John Smith, dairy worker, age 32, born North Carolina, and that single line represents a man who rises at 4 every morning, works until dark, and goes to bed smelling of manure and hay. His labor becomes 500 gallons of milk per week, a line item in the estate's attempt to balance accounts that will never truly balance. On paper, the operation is rational. In practice, it asks people to organize their entire lives around making a private house viable as an economic ecosystem. The more the estate tries to pay for itself, the more lives it pulls into its orbit. Dairy workers, farmhands, foresters, gardeners, drivers, mechanics, all working to sustain a structure whose fundamental purpose is not economic, but symbolic. In 1900, Cornelius Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born in the Louis XVIII room, the future heir arriving in a suite decorated with imported paneling and European textiles. The birth is private, attended by physicians and nurses brought to the estate, but its significance is public. Biltmore has an heir, ensuring the estate's continuation into another generation. Photographs and guest books from the following decade show the house at its social height. Diplomats, authors like Edith Wharton and Henry James, and politicians arriving for house parties that might last weeks. The guest lists read like a directory of Gilded Age elite: Roosevelts, Astors, visiting European nobility, artists and writers whose presence adds cultural prestige to financial power. For guests, Biltmore represents a unique American achievement, a house that rivals European estates in scale and sophistication, but exists in a distinctly American landscape. For the servants, these events mean a grueling choreography. Estate material and later interpretations compare Biltmore's rhythm to a luxury hotel: multiple seatings, late dinners, early shooting breakfasts, constant laundry, and layers of service that must remain invisible. A house party of 20 guests might mean 30 additional people to feed, including guests' personal servants, 50 extra beds to make, hundreds of additional dishes to wash, countless fires to lay and tend, and a social schedule that extends from early morning until past midnight. Under Mrs. King's direction, maids lay fires, refresh linens, polish marble stair treads, and lay out gowns. Butlers coordinate wine service and supervise footmen. Kitchen staff move through heat and steam to produce multi-course meals. The coordination is extraordinary. A dinner for 24 might require 3 courses before the soup itself, fish, an entree, roast, salad, dessert, and savories, each course requiring different dishes, different wines, different service protocols. Surviving recollections from domestic workers at similar houses describe collapsing into bed after midnight and rising before 6, a likely pattern here as well. One former servant at a comparable Newport mansion recalled, "We were young and strong, but even so, by the end of a house party week, some of the girls would be crying from exhaustion. You didn't dare show it upstairs, though. That was an instant dismissal." On the service stair landings, a small secondary clock hangs at eye level. A footman glances at it before stepping through a concealed door into a tapestry-hung hall, face smoothed, posture perfect. The clock shows 8:47, 13 minutes until the next course must be cleared. He has time, barely, if everything moves like clockwork, which it must. The clock does not record how many days like this he will endure before his knees give out or he leaves for work with fewer rules. It doesn't capture the moment when performance becomes second nature, when you stop being yourself and become the role, the invisible servant, the perfect mechanism, the human component of the house's machinery. Above stairs, time is leisure. Below, it is a sequence of orders that never fully end. In 1909, a dispute between George Vanderbilt and Carl Schenck exploded into the open. Schenk's own memoirs recount an argument over hunting rights and forest management in which Vanderbilt, pressed by costs and changing markets, sides against his forester. The specifics are complex. Questions about who can hunt where, whether scientific management should bow to social custom, whether the forester or the owner has final say over land use. But the underlying issue is simpler: money. The result: Schenk's dismissal and the eventual closure of the Biltmore Forest School. The school had graduated several classes of foresters by 1909, many of whom would go on to influential positions in government and private forestry. The Biltmore method of selective cutting and sustained yield, developed and taught here, would shape American forest management for decades. But the institution that created this legacy could not survive a conflict between professional expertise and aristocratic privilege. Behind the personality clash lies arithmetic. Income from timber, dairy, and agriculture cannot keep pace with taxes, salaries, and ongoing maintenance. Construction had cost an estimated $5 million by the 1890s. The interest and upkeep never stopped. By 1909, even Vanderbilt's substantial fortune felt the strain of supporting a 250-room house and 125,000-acre domain that produced more prestige than profit. The dismissal is recorded as a professional decision. For students and workers, it is a rupture. Some foresters scatter to other jobs in government and private industry, carrying Biltmore training with them. Others drift back to family farms or take work in the region's evolving timber economy. The workers who maintained the school's field sites, building trails, clearing demonstration plots, fighting fires, found themselves suddenly without employment, their specialized skills less valuable than general labor. The Biltmore method of selective cutting and sustained yield spreads, but the school that formed them evaporates from the estate. In a quiet irony, Schenk's departure marks the point where Vanderbilt begins to look more to the federal government as a future steward of his land, a shift that will turn privately managed slopes into public forest. The logic is emerging. If the estate cannot sustain itself economically, perhaps it can achieve immortality through donation. If the forests cannot pay dividends, perhaps they can pay in legacy. The calculation is not yet explicit in 1909, but the foundation is laid. The man hired to make the forest pay is dismissed just as the owner realizes the forest may have to be given away. On the 6th of March 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington, D.C., following complications from an emergency appendectomy. He is 51, in the prime of life by any reasonable measure, suddenly dead from what should have been a routine surgery in an era when medicine is advancing, but antibiotics don't yet exist. His obituary notes his patronage of art and philanthropy, his role in founding American forestry, and his creation of a great estate in North Carolina. For Asheville, the real impact lies in what comes next: the sale of about 86,000 acres of Biltmore land to the U.S. government, laying groundwork for Pisgah National Forest. Widowed Edith Vanderbilt completes negotiations he began, selling at a price widely described as below market value, with the condition that the land be preserved. The transaction represents both philanthropy and necessity. The estate cannot afford to maintain such vast acreage, and selling to the government ensures some version of the conservation vision will continue. The sale reduces the estate from 125,000 acres to a core of roughly 8,000 acres, including the house and immediate grounds. What remains is more manageable economically, but also less impressive symbolically. The vision of a private domain stretching to the horizon is replaced by a more modest reality: a very large house with substantial but finite grounds, surrounded by public land where anyone can now hike or hunt. For forestry workers, the transition means new uniforms and bosses, but the same steep slopes. The men who worked under Schenk's management now work for the U.S. Forest Service, following similar principles but serving a different master. Some welcome the change. Government employment means more security, clearer rules, less dependence on one family's finances. Others resent the loss of the personal connection, however asymmetric, that came with working directly for the estate. For tenant farmers, it may mean relocation as federal management changes land use. Some tenant arrangements are honored during the transition. Others end as the Forest Service consolidates control and begins managing land for public rather than private benefit. Families who had lived for years on estate land suddenly face decisions about whether to move, where to go, how to maintain their livelihoods. For house staff, the crisis is subtler. The patron whose signature sat on their payslips is gone, and the future of the house as a private home is suddenly uncertain. Mrs. Edith Vanderbilt will continue to operate the estate, but with reduced income, reduced staff, and the shadow of her husband's death over everything. Some servants stay, others seek positions elsewhere, recognizing that the era of grand house parties and unlimited budgets has ended. In servants' areas, Mrs. King's correspondence hints at strain. She resigns later that year, beginning a new life far from Asheville. After 17 years of service, managing staff, coordinating with the family, maintaining impossible standards, she simply leaves. Whether she was pushed out by changing circumstances or left voluntarily, the record doesn't say. Her departure marks the end of an era as surely as Vanderbilt's death does. The man who tried to own an entire view dies in another city, and the government becomes his largest heir. By 1930, under pressure from the Great Depression, and at the city of Asheville's request, Cornelia and her husband, John Cecil, opened Biltmore House to paying visitors. Estate and local histories describe an explicit goal: boost tourism and preserve the house by turning it into a public attraction. The Depression has devastated Asheville's economy. The city's aggressive borrowing to fund 1920s growth has left it with debts it cannot pay. Tourism offers a path to recovery, and Biltmore, already famous, architecturally significant, and full of treasures, is the obvious centerpiece. The shift is operational as much as symbolic. Servants become staff, private corridors become tour routes, new roles, ticket takers, guides, security, join gardeners and housekeepers. Where a maid once hurried unseen through a passage, a docent now pauses there to explain how invisible labor used to function. The irony is noted by some of the remaining long-term employees. They are now performing their work in front of audiences, explaining to tourists how they used to do the same work in secret. Visitor brochures from the mid-20th century emphasize grandeur: 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, an indoor pool. The people who cleaned those fireplaces or sat by that empty pool checking for leaks remain mostly unnamed, but they are still there, just in uniforms with logos instead of plain aprons. The transition from private service to public employment changes some things: set hours, clearer job descriptions, eventually benefits and protections that domestic service never offered. But the fundamental relationship between the house and those who maintain it remains. The building demands constant care, and people provide it year after year, generation after generation. Clocks continue to regulate their days, now synchronized with tour schedules and bus arrivals rather than bell pulls from a second-floor sitting room. The master turret clock is no longer a symbol of aristocratic precision, but it still tells everyone when they can finally go home. The opening of tours at 9 a.m., the lunch break at 12:30, the closing at 5 p.m., all governed by the same timekeeping logic that once coordinated servants' movements. The estate survives by inviting the public to admire a system whose hardest work they will never fully see. Tourists marvel at the banquet hall, the library, the indoor pool, the gardens, but they spend minutes in each space. The staff who clean, maintain, repair, and preserve spend lifetimes, their knowledge of the building's quirks and needs accumulating over years of daily contact. They know which floorboards creak, which windows leak, which radiators need bleeding, which doors stick in humid weather. This knowledge is never part of the tour, but it is what keeps the house functioning as more than a museum piece. In 1963, Biltmore was designated a National Historic Landmark, securing its status as a piece of national heritage. The recognition is both honor and burden. The house is now officially significant, which means higher standards for preservation, more scrutiny of changes, and greater responsibility to maintain the building not just for the current family, but for the nation. In 1976, Cornelia's son, William A. V. Cecil, inherits the house and continues the transformation into a major tourist destination with hotels, a winery, and branded products. The estate that once lost money trying to be self-sustaining finally achieves something like economic viability by becoming a business rather than a home. The house is still owned by the family, but it functions as a corporation with employees numbered in the thousands in revenues from admissions, events, wine sales, and hotel bookings. The workforce grew to more than 2,000 employees in the 21st century, making Biltmore one of the region's largest employers. For Asheville and Buncombe County, the estate has become economically essential, providing jobs, attracting tourists who spend money throughout the region, anchoring an entire industry built around heritage tourism and mountain recreation. The transformation from private domain to public attraction is complete. Biltmore is no longer primarily a family residence, but a visitor destination that happens to have family connections. Yet the risks of working a private landscape never fully disappear. In June 2022, an FDNY firefighter on vacation was killed when a tree fell on his car as he drove up the estate's entrance road. The death is ruled accidental, a windstorm, an old tree. Tragic timing. But it underscores that the estate is not just a museum set, but a living landscape with real hazards. In April 2023, a Biltmore employee died when high winds fell another tree on a trail worker. State investigations ruled the estate not at fault, but the human cost lands locally. The worker was maintaining trails, doing the kind of landscape management that has continued since Schenk's day, when a mature tree came down in a sudden gust. The family grieves privately. The estate issues a statement. Work continues. In September 2024, Tropical Storm Helene flooded parts of the property, damaging farms and outbuildings and killing animals, even as the house itself remained largely intact. The storm devastates western North Carolina, killing more than 40 people in Buncombe County alone, washing away roads and bridges, leaving communities without power or water for weeks. Biltmore closes temporarily, assesses damage, and begins cleanup. A month later, Biltmore pledges $2 million regional relief, a philanthropic gesture echoing its founder's reputation while acknowledging how deeply the estate is embedded in the region's economy. The donation is significant and genuinely helpful, but it also reflects an awareness that the estate's survival depends on the region's recovery. If tourists can't reach Asheville, Biltmore's business model collapses. On that November morning in 2024, when the conservator adjusts the lamp to read the old clock order, the servants' corridor is part of a tour route. Mrs. King's room has been opened as an interpretive stop, with a period vacuum, dusters, and brushes laid out as artifacts. The room where she once slept, exhausted after another 14-hour day, rising again before dawn to do it all again, is now a display about domestic service, visited by tourists who spend perhaps 90 seconds glancing at the tools and reading the wall text before moving on. Visitors will pass through in small groups, glancing up at the plain wall clock without realizing it once governed someone's 14-hour day. The clock's face is simple, functional, unmarked by any indication of the human cost it measured. It shows hours and minutes, nothing more. It doesn't record the exhaustion, the pride, the resentment, the resignation, the small satisfactions of work well done under impossible conditions. In current brochures, the house is a family-friendly destination. In maintenance logs and OSHA reports, it remains a workplace with real hazards and unending schedules. The day's last tour has gone, and the corridor outside the servants' dining room is empty again. A modern staff member in a logoed fleece reaches up, almost without thinking, to straighten the shaded electric lamp beneath the old wall clock before heading downstairs. The clock's hands, driven now by a modern mechanism but still set by a schedule, show closing time. No bell rings. There's only the faint tick, the hum of distant HVAC behind stone, and beyond the easier window, the dark line of the Blue Ridge, where the old estate once stretched unbroken. The same gesture, adjusting the light beneath a clock, has meant different things here for more than a century: obedience, exhaustion, pride, preservation. The house remains lit. The valley outside still works to keep it that way.